Thank you for coming. And 2024 has been a great year for IHO. We're in the middle of celebrating the 50th anniversary of Lucy, the 3.2 million-year-old partial skeleton found by IHO's founding director, Don Johansson. And as one of the programs in our celebration of Lucy 50th, we have this monthly themed lecture series, which started in February. And we had all of our research scientists give talks on various subjects related to human origins. And today's program is a continuity of that monthly series lecture program. So we have Professor Curtis Marean today, and I'll try my best to introduce you really well, as you deserve it. So Curtis is a foundation professor in the School of Human Evolution and Social Change and IHO research scientist. His primary research focus has been on the final stages of human evolution, particularly the origins of anatomically modern humans and human behavior. His interest in the relationship between ancient climates and environments and human behavior led him to develop an international transdisciplinary project called the South African Coast Paleoclimate, Paleoenvironment, Paleoecology, and Paleoanthropology. SAC-P4, is that how you call it? Okay. This project has centered on research along the southern shores of South Africa, specifically at Pinnacle Point near Muzzle Bay. Curtis and his team have been working at the site for over 30 years now, I think. Alongside his research, Curtis has also been active in helping develop programs in local institutions in South Africa, such as one at the Nelson Mandela University. His research findings at Pinnacle Point have contributed significantly to our understanding of the beginnings of modern human behavior and the first appearance of anatomically modern Homo sapiens in South Africa. Notably, he and his team documented the world's oldest evidence of coastal foraging, the earliest evidence of complex pyrotechnology, and the first expression of microlithic technology. In addition, Curtis has compiled extensive data on ancient climates and environments, further shedding light on the origins of modern humans in South Africa. The beginning of modern human migration out of Africa started around 60 to 70,000 years ago. So why did they leave Africa at this specific time and not earlier, right? And gave rise to all non-African populations. What happened to the earlier populations that were displaced by the incoming modern humans? Did they interbreed? In his talk this evening on the Great Human Diaspora, Curtis will address those questions and many others, and based on his broad research on this important subject. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Curtis to the podium. Thank you.
Thank you. Everybody hear me okay with the mic? Thanks, Johannes. So jumping right into it, the great modern human diaspora. Sometime between 70 and 60,000 years ago, modern humans leave Africa. And if you notice, there's a confusing array of arrows in that point. And I'm going to come back at the very end of the talk to talk about that confusing array of arrows. We have new evidence that they made it all the way to Australia by 65,000 years ago. And in that part of the diaspora, Denisovans, who were the resident hominins in that region, and other archaic humans go extinct. And there's a megafaunal extinction in Australia that's roughly coincident. They make it into Western Europe at least by 45,000 years ago, and I think that date is probably a methodological artifact, a reflection of the fact that radiocarbon can only go back that far. We're starting to get some evidence that they're there probably by 55. And there's another extinction that occurs at 40,000. Neanderthals go extinct. Modern humans make it above the Arctic Circle, so they spread into the Arctic by 45,000 years ago. And they make it into a now gone land mass that we call Beringia was exposed by lower sea levels by about 25,000 years ago, and they're holed up there for about 10,000 years, and then they make it into North America by 14 to 13,000 years ago. And we see another extinction event. There's a megafaunal extinction event at that point. So that's the big pattern. That's probably 250 journal articles summarized in one slide. And then what I'm going to do in this talk, I'm going to start with asking the question, what do we mean by modern human? Because I focused on the modern human diaspora. What is a modern human? I'm going to discuss the significance of what I'm just going to call the modern human triad. I'm going to explain why climate change, even though I've studied it all my life, I think is largely irrelevant to the evolution of modern humans. And I'm going to offer an alternative driving force for the evolution of modern humans. And then finally, I'm going to wrap it up by explaining a variety of hypotheses for the route out of Africa, and that's going to address that confusing array of red arrows I had. And I'm going to offer one new route, which I think is starting to take shape as being a reasonable route for people out of Africa, but hasn't really been discussed so far. So Homo sapiens and modern humans are not the same thing. And we often use those words interchangeably and in a confusing way, and I think we need to stop doing that. Homo sapiens are defined by anatomical features that fall within the range of variation of modern humans. But modern humans, us, we're defined by psychological, emotional, and cognitive characteristics that fall within the range of the variation of modern humans. It's probable that there were populations of Homo sapiens that were not modern humans in the Pleistocene. I think it's almost certainly likely, and there were probably multiple subpopulations of Homo sapiens that weren't modern. Modern humans they had to have been a subpopulation of what we call Homo sapiens. They must have evolved in Africa, and they must have evolved before 70,000 years ago, before the diaspora. These are kind of truisms that I think we have to accept. Homo sapiens are recognized by the fossil anatomical record. But recognizing modern humans requires the archaeological record, which can tell us about the behavior of that subpopulation. So Homo sapiens, we define them by anatomy. They have a small and gracile face, basic cranial flexion. They have a modest and separated or a totally absent supraorbital torus, no retromolar space, and they have a high rounded neurocranium. And by 110,000 years ago, it takes on a globular shape to the brain case. There's a very cool paper by Neubauer et al. In 2018, and they actually associate that globular brain case with the recognition of modern humans by co-associating it with modern human cognition. Modern humans are defined by psychological and emotional and cognitive features. These include an innate proclivity to cooperate at very high scales with unrelated individuals. For this talk, I'm just going to call that hyper-prosociality. An innate obsession and reliance on social learning through high-fidelity copying, and the most advanced organic ability to acquire knowledge and understanding, what we call an advanced cognition or a modern human cognition. And that's the triad that I was talking about before. That's what we need to use to recognize us in the archaeological and fossil record. So when you add that modern human cognition to that special psychology for social learning and that extreme cooperation, that sets up the ability or the capacity for the modern human cumulative cultural adaptation. So without those three things, we simply can't have that cumulative cultural adaptation. And these three capacities or proclivities, they're evolved and they're embedded in the genome. So I think that the causative mechanism for the great human diaspora was the very late evolution of that hyper-prosociality, uniquely in the modern human lineage. And it wasn't present in all subpopulations of Homo sapiens. It evolved in one subpopulation of Homo sapiens, that's the modern human. So it evolved in one lineage. It evolved, I think, probably between 200 and 100,000 years ago. So at the very end of the human evolution time frame. And I think it evolved in the context of complex hunter-gatherers and not non-complex hunter-gatherers. And I'm going to get into what I mean by that in a couple of minutes. And I think climate change is largely irrelevant to that evolutionary process. So what do I mean? What does extreme cooperation or hyper-prosociality include? It includes this emotional complex of usness and groupness that we often refer to as tribal and nationalistic feelings. We've seen a heck of a lot of that over the last decade expressing itself in our society. But it allows high levels of cooperation with non-kin. It allows cooperative breeding or formal mate exchange and what we call in anthropology reciprocal exogamy. And it facilitates multi-scale society, the formation of ethno-linguistic groups, and extended social networks. And this is what we often refer to as the troop to tribe transition. And it's innate and it's unique to modern humans among extant species. So just to give you a quick overview of what I mean, chimps don't have this hyper-prosociality. They have a troop structure. And there's generally conflict between those troops. And in hunter-gatherer ethnography, the equivalent of those troops we would call bands, right, or the foraging unit. Modern hunter-gatherers have this innate hyper-prosociality that allows them to form tribal structure. So we have those troops or bands, but they're tied together by formal mate exchange, that reciprocal exogamy that links them all together into a tribe. And often at the contacts of those tribal groups, we have conflict. Sometimes we don't. And a good overview is in this book by Chapace, 2008, Primeval Kinship. So I think when we have different societies in conflict, tribal societies, which is the modern human derived condition, always will replace those societies that don't form tribal groups. So I think what happened is this tribal structure evolved in Africa uniquely among modern humans, and that gave them the ability to exit out of Africa and simply replace all other competing non-modern humans very quickly and effectively. So changes in paleoclimate and paleoenvironment could not have driven the evolution of this modern human triad. I think it's driven by internal dynamics, changes in internal dynamics. And examples of those changing internal dynamics would be things like shifts to more dense and predictable resources, changes in the intensity of warfare, technological innovations with downstream social impacts. But I think the primary driver was a slow drive toward greater cultural complexity among the hunter-gatherers in Africa. So why is climate change insufficient to explain the evolution of the triad? To make that case, I'm going to summarize a wide body of data and theory about hunter-gatherers. That data and theory resides in human macroecology, human behavioral ecology, standard comparative ethnography, and evolutionary psychology. And again, it represents many, many, many papers. But first, what do we mean by cultural complexity? Cultural complexity has a wide range of realms. For example, it has a technological realm, which is the number of parts that are in a tool and the number of raw materials that are included in it. There's a social realm. The amount of economic and political differentiation is a key part of that social realm complexity. And there's institutional realms, so the number of rules and regulations and laws and norms. So complex hunter-gatherers have a number of traits which are consistent across the ethnographic record. Their diet is almost always aquatic plus terrestrial or fully aquatic. They generally rely on lots of storage. Their technology is often heavy and hard to move around. They have very few residential moves, and sometimes they live in villages all year round. Band sizes tend to be large, 100 individuals or more, sometimes up to 500, 600 individuals in a single group. The territory sizes are small and tightly packed. The sociality is generally non-egalitarian, and can even be stratified. And warfare levels tend to be very high, and some of these groups even employ slavery. Some examples are the Inuit, Tlingit, and the Chumash. Non-complex hunter-gatherers tend to have diets that are dominated by terrestrial plants and animals. They have very little storage, and if they do have storage, it's short-term. Their technology is light. It can be carried by one person on their back. Their residential moves are many, 10 to 50 a year. Band sizes are small, 20 to 30 individuals. Territory sizes are large. Sociality is often egalitarian. They have very little formal social differentiation, and warfare is often quite low. And examples of these are the Khoisan, Pygmies, and Hadza. So to give you an example of how aquatic resource use drives hunter-gatherer complexity, I've put on two graphs. Each dot represents an ethno-linguistic group. Technological complexity is on the y-axis as measured by techno-units, which is the number of parts. ET is effective temperature, which is a proxy for seasonality and temperatures. On that axis, we have the percentage of diet that is fishing or shellfishing. That bracketed area is the entirety of Africa. Those environments are warm, they're unseasonal, they rarely, if ever, have any snow, they don't have long, cold seasons. In that bracket, we have colder environments, they have swings between winter and summer, and these are temperate latitudes and above. And as you can see, hunter-gatherers that live in higher seasonal environments have much more complicated technologies. But the problem is, all of the climate change that we have in Africa over millions of years never drives outside that box, which means that climate change that we've seen in Africa cannot possibly drive increases in hunter-gatherer complexity. So that motion toward greater complexity simply can't be. The only way is to add aquatic foods to the diet to drive up the complexity of that technology. So why do aquatic resources cause complexity? They are dense and predictable resources that trigger warfare. And this is documented by animal ethnology, comparative ethnography of hunter-gatherers, and archaeology, and supported by the theory of economic defendability. Dense and predictable resources reduce mobility. They often require complex tools to exploit. And reduced mobility facilitates more complex tools, so you get a positive feedback relationship between the two. And this also drives population increase. So hunter-gatherers that use these dense and predictable aquatic resources end up being complex hunter-gatherers. And we have outstanding ethnographic records to document this. So what are these dense and predictable resources in Africa? They are fishing, and they are using coastal intertidal resources and deep sea resources. The problem with fishing is it requires complex technology. So you have to have time to ratchet up the technology to use them effectively. But intertidal resources don't require any technology, just a bag to drop them in. But you do have to have a complex cognition to figure out the relationship between lunar tidal scheduling and intertidal resource availability. So when do these types of adaptations appear in Africa? And I summarize these in a paper that I published in 2016, but I'm going to update it in this figure. In South Africa, we have coastal foraging all the way back to 160,000 years ago. And that's documented at Pinnacle Point, and Johannes mentioned that in just a minute. In North Africa, we have coastal foraging between 125 and 100,000 years ago. And then basically North Africa looks like it's abandoned for quite some time, and then it picks up again at 25,000 years ago. In the Sahara and the Nile, we have it pick up around 25,000 years ago. In Central Africa, roughly the same time. And in fact, this radiation of riverine lake adaptation seems to be across Africa almost synchronously, also in East Africa. There is one site called Katanda that is dated at 90,000 years ago, but that really needs confirmation on the dating. That was done when luminescence techniques were in their infancy, and I think we absolutely have to validate that date before we can consider it acceptable. But we have a very recent, very reliable date from SM1 in Ethiopia that's dated with the Toba cryptotephra, and many of you here have heard us talk about that paper because that work was done by the IH cryptotephra team. So that means the earliest evidence we have for hunter-gatherers using dense and predictable resources anywhere in the world is in South Africa. And I still think this is the best possible location for the development of complex hunter-gatherers. So the original hominin adaptation up to 200,000 years ago was this. It was a tropical terrestrial hunter-gatherer. They focused on terrestrial plants and animals. They had very little storage. Their technology was light, carried by one person. They had many residential moves. Band size was 20 to 30. Territory size was very large. And originally, the sociality starts as the primitive ape stratified condition that we see in chimps. And the warfare would have been rather low in the hominid line. So despite all that climate change we have over millions of years, that adaptation just oscillates within this rather simple adaptation. But there is one really important change that happens. And somewhere, sometime, that sociality evolves into an egalitarian social condition. And we don't know anything about that, and it's a very interesting research question that needs to be investigated. Modern humans are psychologically and cognitively over-engineered for this niche, though we inhabit it very effectively. So this niche could not have driven the evolution of the modern human triad. The evolution of modern humans requires a cultural niche of greater complexity, and that can only happen in Africa by increasing the reliance on aquatic resources, which increases sedentism, increases technological complexity, increases social and institutional complexity, and increases warfare. And that creates the selection regime for hyper-prosocial sociality and selection for the high levels of complex social learning that we see in modern humans. So in summary, the original hominin adaptation up to 200,000 years ago is a consistent reliance on tropical terrestrial food niche, which results in a very slow ratchet of the cultural niche. That slow ratchet of the cultural niche drives this slow cognitive increase that we see in the anatomical record, such as the evolution of early Homo and Homo erectus. And at 300,000 years ago, Homo sapiens, such as the fossils at Jebel Ir-Hood, still retain that primitive ape form of low prosociality and a lack of multi-scale society. That's why they never get out of Africa, or they get into the Levant and eventually get pushed back. So at 300,000 years ago, Homo sapiens has evolved, but they lived in troops, not tribes, and thus they're not modern humans. The final steps to a modern human required the aquatic food revolution. So the slow evolution of a complex cognition up to about 300 to 200,000 years ago allows modern humans to expand into that aquatic resource niche. That aquatic hunter, we see the evolution of an aquatic hunter-gatherer adaptation between 200 and 100,000 years ago. And that sets up the selection regime for this hyper-prosociality and complex social learning that we see in modern humans, and the formation of multi-scale society. And at that point, we have tribal society. And then you add to that the evolution of complex projectile weapons, and we have the great human diaspora, and they spread around the world in an almost instant. So at 70,000 years ago, The most invasive species we've ever seen has now evolved. But how does it get out of Africa? So just to give you a little background, on the left-hand side, I have a global record for climate change. And when that line is up above, it's in an interglacial, and when it's down below, it's in a glacial. That's isotope stage 6, 195,000 years ago to 130,000 years ago. And that's one of the coldest glacial phases on record. And during that time, much of Africa is a desert, a sand sea desert. So the Sahara, and of course the Arabian Peninsula is just an extension of the Sahara. The Sahara expands south, it's drier than it is now, and there's no way out of Africa at that point. Modern humans are bottled up. There's a cork in the exit out of Africa. Then we have what we call the Green Sahara hypothesis, and that occurs during marine isotope stage 5e. And you can see I put a little green dot at the point of marine isotope stage 5e. During 5e, the world is warmer than it is in the Holocene. Sea levels are higher, and much of Africa responds at that point with higher levels of rainfall. And we know that the Sahara at that point is a grassland because we have fossils out there of grassland living animals. There are lakes, there are rivers, they're filled with hippos and crocodiles. There's a huge population of people, hunter-gatherers, living in that massive landmass of the Sahara. And some of those seep out of Africa. And that's what we call the failed Homo sapiens exit. And there's some gene flow, there's some introgression into the Neanderthal line at that point. But they never succeed in going beyond that region. That's because they're not modern humans. They're archaics still. They probably make it down into the Arabian Peninsula, and we have an archaeological record there for them. And then you can see world climate rapidly descends into a glacial phase after that. And it seems likely that that massive population that was in the Sahara could have been pushed in a variety of directions, and one of them was out of Africa. Another, of course, is south into Eastern Africa and so on. But we now end up with a desert once again. This is what we call the blue highways hypothesis. We are now down into isotope stage 4. And the blue highways are the rivers in the catchment of the Nile, which reach all the way up into the Sinai. SM1, the site that I just talked about, is on one of those blue highways, and it shows occupation at that time, and it shows a fishing adaptation. So the blue highways hypothesis argues that people follow those rivers up to the Sinai, but then it has a problem because it doesn't have an explanation for how people cross the Sinai and the Negev out of the Levant and into the rest of the world. Then we have what's called the coastal route hypothesis and what I'll call the Red Sea variant. This also occurs during isotope stage 4. And in the coastal route hypothesis, people follow the Red Sea, which in this region is primarily mangrove, up to the Sinai. They may have bled over from the blue highways onto the coast. They come down the eastern coast of the Red Sea. They follow the coastal route out of Yemen and Oman. And just as an aside, the coastal area of Oman and Yemen is a super rich intertidal zone because there are cold upwelling currents in that area, almost as productive as the South African coast. And then they exit out of that zone in the Arabian Peninsula, which I think is highly unlikely, because as soon as you get into the Persian Gulf, the productivity of the intertidal zone plummets. So there's no coastal way to eat your way out from that point and that way. And again, I find this very hard to accept because this is very rugged terrain, a mix of deserts and mountains, and how do they get to Australia 65, almost instantaneously, making its way through there? It seems unlikely to me. It's possible, but unlikely. There is a Bab el-Mandab variant of the coastal route hypothesis, and that is they cross the Bab el-Mandab Strait and avoid the Red Sea, and I think that's likely, because the Red Sea doesn't look to me like a great route to forge your way in a coastal manner. It just doesn't have the productivity that you need. But that hypothesis also has them then following the coast out of Yemen and Oman and this way, and so on. There are potential problems with these hypotheses, and I think clues to a new model. The problem is this emerging evidence that modern humans made it to Australia and other areas in Southeast Asia by 65,000 years ago. That's really fast movement. It posits an unlikely pace for movement across Southern Asia. And some of you might say, hey, people made it through North America and South America all the way to Tierra del Fuego in a couple hundred years. But there's a difference. Nobody was in the Americas. They had to contend with resisting Neanderthal and Denisovan groups to make it through that region. So that's not a good analogy to overturn this problem. And the clue is that we have several coastal sites in Southeast Asia with advanced maritime adaptations by 45,000 years ago. They're showing deep sea fishing, they're indicating long transport seaworthy vessel technology, and I think that 45,000-year-old age is a minimum age due to the radiocarbon limits. It's a methodological artifact. I think those sites could be a lot older than that. So I'm going to suggest a new hypothesis. And again, this starts at isotope stage 4 at 70,000 years ago. People jump the Bab el-Mandab Strait. They get into these really rich coastal zones in Yemen and Oman, and they ratchet up an intertidal adaptation to a maritime adaptation. It could happen on the coast of Somalia, because Somalia also has a cold, upwelling intertidal zone with very rich foraging opportunities in it. So they ratchet that intertidal zone adaptation up, and they make the transition to a maritime hunter-gatherer, and they sail their way to Southeast Asia, following the natural sailing currents in that zone. And that easily gets them into Southeast Asia and Australia by 65,000 years ago, and eliminates all these other problems for how they got across those regions that fast. So that I call the coast to sea hypothesis. So to conclude what I've said, modern humans are defined by evolved psychological, emotional, and cognitive characters. Those characters require evolutionary explanations just like anatomical features do. Climate change is insufficient explanation for their evolution. It was a cultural change that drove those last steps to modern humans. And I think a shift to aquatic resources is the most likely cultural change. The route out of Africa is still not resolved. We need a lot of field work to answer this question, but a coastal to maritime exit solves many of the chronological dilemmas that are starting to arise in the empirical record. So that's it. Thank you for your attention.